The grand exhibition hall was blindingly bright, filled with popping camera flashes and elite VIPs. In the center sat a pristine, $2 million hypercar. Vanessa Clark, the ruthless CEO, stepped up to start the engine for the grand reveal. She pressed the ignition. Absolute dead silence. The engine was completely dead. Her technicians scrambled, panicking. Nothing worked. A single dad, working as a janitor, paused his floor buffer and looked at the engine bay. Vanessa scoffed loudly. "What are you looking at? Fix my $2 million car then, janitor." The wealthy crowd laughed. 30 minutes later, he turned the key, and a V12 engine violently roared to life. His name was Marcus Hale, 45 years old with deeply calloused hands permanently stained with the faint, indelible ghosts of high-octane grease, and a quiet, immovable posture that made him practically invisible to the wealthy elites who walked past him every single day. He was a single father. His entire universe, the absolute center of his beating heart, was his 10-year-old son, Evan. Evan was a brilliant, endlessly energetic boy with a massive, encyclopedic obsession with sports cars. His small bedroom walls were completely plastered with glossy posters of Ferraris, Koenigsegg's, and Paganis. He knew brake horsepower statistics better than his spelling words. Every night, Marcus would sit on the edge of Evan's bed, listening to his son talk about aerodynamics and downforce, smiling warmly, hiding the crushing, exhausting weight of their financial reality. Marcus wasn't an uneducated man. He wasn't a guy who just pushed a broom because he lacked ambition. For nearly 2 decades, Marcus Hale had been the absolute apex predator of the automotive world. He was the senior lead technician at an ultra-exclusive, high-performance European tuning shop. He was the man billionaires quietly requested by name when their multi-million-dollar exotics started misfiring. He understood the complex, terrifyingly precise language of twin-turbocharged V12 engines and highly volatile dual-clutch transmissions better than anyone on the East Coast. But life is completely, brutally unpredictable. 3 years ago, the owner of the tuning shop made a series of catastrophic financial gambles. The massive shop abruptly declared bankruptcy, the heavy bay doors were permanently chained shut, and Marcus's highly specialized elite position vanished into thin air over a single weekend. At 42, starting over was a nightmare. The local dealerships couldn't afford his massive salary, and he refused to move his son across the country away from his school and his friends just to chase a job. With his savings bleeding out and the terrifying reality of rent hanging over his head, Marcus completely swallowed his massive pride. He took a steady, low-stress, union-backed job as a night shift janitor at the city's premier international exhibition center. It provided absolute stability. It provided premium health insurance for Evan. Marcus never explicitly hid his masterful past, but he never bragged about it either. He just put his head down, put on the faded blue janitorial uniform, pushed his heavy floor buffer, and made sure his son had food on the table. Tonight, the exhibition center was vibrating with frantic, high-stakes energy. The sprawling, polished marble floor was rented out by Vanessa Clark, 38 years old, impeccably dressed in designer silk. With a notoriously ruthless reputation, Vanessa was the CEO of Apex Imports, a rapidly expanding luxury automotive distributor. Tonight was the most critical night of her entire career. She was hosting an ultra-exclusive, invite-only gala to officially sign a massive, multi-million-dollar distribution contract with a boutique Italian hypercar manufacturer. The absolute centerpiece of the entire gala, sitting beneath a massive silk cover under blinding spotlights, was the car itself. A bespoke, $2 million carbon fiber hypercar. It had literally just arrived via a secure, climate-controlled shipping container from Milan a few hours prior. Because of the intensely tight, aggressive PR schedule Vanessa demanded, the car had been rolled straight off the truck and onto the showroom floor. It had entirely bypassed the standard, rigorous pre-delivery inspection, PDI protocol. The massive hall was packed with venture capitalists, automotive journalists, and social media influencers. At 8 p.m. exactly, the dramatic orchestral music swelled. The silk cover was dramatically pulled away. The crowd gasped in pure awe at the aggressive, beautiful machine. Vanessa stepped up to the podium, smiling radiantly for the flashing cameras. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vanessa announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the hall, "I present the future of raw, untamed performance. Let's hear it breathe." She opened the sleek carbon fiber driver's door, slid into the plush Alcantara seat, and dramatically pressed the glowing red engine start button on the steering wheel. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting for the deafening, glorious roar of a naturally aspirated V12 engine. Instead, they heard absolutely nothing. Not a crank, not a sputter, not even a click. Absolute, horrifying, dead silence. Vanessa frowned, her perfect smile freezing. She pressed the button again. Harder this time. Still nothing. The Hypercar was a $2 million brick. The atmosphere in the massive exhibition hall instantly transformed from a luxurious celebration into a suffocating, incredibly awkward nightmare. The wealthy investors began to whisper among themselves. The automotive journalists immediately raised their cameras, hungry for the impending PR disaster. Vanessa's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. She aggressively stepped out of the car, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble. She shot a terrifying, murderous glare at her team of elite, factory-trained technicians standing nervously by the velvet ropes. "Fix it!" Vanessa hissed venomously under her breath, maintaining a forced, incredibly fake smile for the cameras. "Right now! Do whatever you have to do!" The team of 3 young, highly paid technicians scrambled over the velvet ropes like panicked ants. They were brilliant with laptops, but severely lacking in practical, high-pressure intuition. They popped the massive rear carbon fiber engine cover. They frantically unrolled a heavy, expensive diagnostic computer and violently jammed the OBD2 scanner into the port under the dashboard. They stared at their glowing screens, sweat visibly pouring down their foreheads. "What is it?" Vanessa demanded, pacing back and forth, watching her massive distribution deal slowly evaporating into thin air. The lead technician, a 25-year-old named Julian, looked absolutely terrified. I don't know, Ms. Clark. The ECU isn't throwing any hard critical failure codes. The battery voltage is perfectly stable at 12.8 volts. The high-pressure fuel rails show 0 pressure, but the pumps aren't even trying to prime." "Are you telling me a brand new $2 million engine is dead?" Vanessa yelled, entirely abandoning her professional composure. "We suspect a catastrophic failure in the immobilizer security module," Julian stammered, typing frantically. "The car thinks it's being stolen. We are attempting to force a hard factory reset on the main electronic control unit, but it's locking us out." 20 feet away, standing quietly near a massive structural pillar, Marcus Hale was leaning casually against the handle of his industrial floor buffer. He wasn't looking at the panic. He wasn't looking at the laptops. He was looking directly at the shiny, perfectly clean brake rotors of the Hypercar, and then at the heavy, thick, brand-new nylon transport straps sitting in a pile near the loading dock doors in the back. He instantly, completely understood exactly what was happening. It wasn't a catastrophic engine failure. It wasn't a fried security module. It was something incredibly basic, entirely simple, and heavily documented in every single high-end European workshop manual in existence. Marcus sighed heavily. He really didn't want to get involved. He was off the clock in 20 minutes, but he thought about the sheer beauty of the machine sitting dead on the floor. It deserved better than to be ripped apart by panicked kids with laptops. He slowly pushed his yellow cleaning cart forward, stepping past the velvet rope. "Excuse me," Marcus said. His voice was deep, incredibly calm, and completely devoid of panic. It cut through the chaotic shouting of the technicians effortlessly. Julian, the lead tech, snapped his head up, glaring at the man in the blue janitor's uniform. "What do you want? Can't you see we are dealing with a massive crisis here? Go empty a trash can." Marcus didn't flinch at the disrespect. He pointed a calloused finger at the rear engine bay. "You aren't going to find a hard failure code on that laptop," Marcus said quietly, stating an absolute fact. "Because the car isn't broken. It was just pulled out of a shipping container, right? It bypassed the PDI bay. Vanessa marched over, her patience entirely violently exhausted. She looked at Marcus's stained uniform, his scuffed work boots, and the mop bucket behind him. In her highly stressed, deeply arrogant mind, he was nothing more than an uneducated nuisance interrupting her brilliant experts. "Who let the cleaning staff onto the display floor?" Vanessa snapped, her voice dripping with pure, toxic condescension. "Ma'am," Marcus continued, completely unfazed by her tone, "high-end European exotics like this are shipped overseas with a highly restricted digital firewall engaged. It's called transport mode. It physically cuts the voltage to the high-pressure fuel pumps and disables the ignition sequence to prevent the battery from dying at sea and to prevent port workers from joyriding the cars. The engine is digitally chained." Julian let out a sharp, arrogant, incredibly dismissive laugh. "Transport mode? Are you kidding me? The dashboard doesn't say transport mode. We know our jobs, buddy. The immobilizer is fried. We need to rip the steering column out." Marcus looked at the young tech with a heavy sigh of pity. "The dashboard won't say it until you access the secondary body control module, which your standard OBD scanner won't read without the proprietary factory software." Vanessa let out a cold, cynical sneer. She had had enough. She turned to the crowd, then looked back at Marcus, deciding to make an example out of him to deflect the embarrassment of the situation. "You think you know more about a $2 million Italian masterpiece than my factory-trained engineers because you sweep the floors?" Vanessa mocked loudly, her voice echoing into the silent hall. "All right then, fix my $2 million car, Janitor. Turn the key." A few of the junior executives and wealthy investors actually chuckled. It was a cruel, performative insult designed entirely to humiliate him and put him back in his place. Marcus didn't flush red with anger. He didn't shout. He didn't defend his honor or pull out his old master technician credentials. He simply looked Vanessa dead in the eye, his expression completely blank, utterly devoid of intimidation. "I'll need you to call the Milan factory representative right now," Marcus said calmly. "And I need you to ask them for the 6-digit alphanumeric unboxing security pin for this specific VIN number. Do it now or you're going to look very foolish in front of these cameras. If you firmly believe that the most massive, complicated problems are often solved by the simplest, most overlooked details, hit that subscribe button to witness the exact moment the janitor proves everyone in the room completely wrong." The entire exhibition hall went completely, utterly silent. The mocking laughter instantly died in the throats of the wealthy investors. Vanessa Clark blinked, completely taken aback by his absolute, unwavering, terrifying confidence. She had expected him to stammer, apologize, and scurry back to the shadows like a whipped dog. Instead, he was aggressively giving her direct, highly specific technical orders. You can't touch that car," Julian stammered, stepping defensively in front of the driver's side door, holding his laptop like a shield. "If you input the wrong sequence, you will permanently brick the main ECU. It voids the manufacturer's warranty." "The warranty doesn't matter if the investors walk out that door in 5 minutes, kid," Marcus stated coldly, stepping right past the young engineer with the heavy, immovable presence of a seasoned veteran. He looked directly at Vanessa. "You gave me a direct order, Ms. Clark. Do you want to hear this V12 engine sing for the cameras, or do you want to keep watching your technicians pretend they know what they're doing?" Vanessa stared at him. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the ticking clock was crushing her lungs. She looked at the dead hypercar. She looked at the restless, whispering crowd. She looked at her incredibly expensive engineers who had completely failed her for the last 20 minutes. She pulled her cell phone out of her designer purse with trembling hands. "Call the Italian rep," Vanessa snapped to her assistant, her voice shaking slightly. "Get me the unboxing pin for this VIN number. Now." Julian looked horrified, but he didn't dare disobey the CEO. He slowly backed away from the car. Marcus didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a wrench. He didn't ask to open the engine bay. He completely ignored the mechanical heart of the car. He slid his tall frame into the incredibly low, tight carbon fiber driver's seat. The smell of rich, bespoke Italian leather washed over him, a scent he hadn't experienced in 3 long years. He didn't look around the cabin in awe like an amateur. He focused entirely on the digital instrument cluster. The dashboard was completely dark, save for a small, blinking red security light. "I have the code," Vanessa said, walking up to the open door, holding her phone. She read off a complex six-digit alphanumeric sequence, a 74B92. The rep said if this is a prank, he's voiding our contract. "It's not a prank," Marcus said quietly. He didn't reach for the ignition button. He knew that pressing it would do absolutely nothing. To disable the deeply embedded transport mode on this specific boutique architecture, you couldn't just plug in a laptop. You had to perform a highly specific physical sequence of inputs to wake up the dormant secondary control module and prove you were an authorized human operator, not a computer glitch. Marcus closed his eyes for a split second, digging deep into his memory, pulling up the technical bulletins he had memorized years ago. He pressed his heavy work boot firmly down on the brake pedal. He held it there. With his left hand, he pulled the high-beam light stalk toward him and held it. With his right hand, he pressed the hazard light button exactly 3 times in rapid succession. Click, click, click. Then he reached down to the center console and inputted the 6-digit PIN code using the small rotary media dial, clicking it into place like a master safecracker opening a bank vault. He released the brake. He released the high-beam stalk. For 5 agonizing, terrifying seconds, absolutely nothing happened. The crowd held its breath. Julian smirked from the sidelines, ready to say, "I told you so." Then, a soft, pleasant, incredibly melodic electronic chime echoed through the luxurious cabin. The massive digital instrument cluster suddenly flared to life. It didn't just turn on, it rebooted. The screens flashed from a dull gray into a brilliant, vivid, high-definition display. The tachometer dial swept all the way to the red line and back down in a perfect, smooth arc. A small green text box appeared in the center of the screen, replacing the flashing red security icon. Transport mode disabled. Systems initialized. "It's alive," Julian whispered in absolute, crushing disbelief, dropping his arms to his sides. Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't pump his fist in the air. He remained perfectly, coldly professional. "Do not press the start button yet," Marcus announced loudly, his voice echoing out of the cabin. "The primary ECU has been starved of data for 3 weeks while crossing the ocean. It needs exactly 120 seconds to perform a complete, full system handshake with the fuel pressure regulators and the transmission control module. If you rush it, you flood the cylinders." The entire massive exhibition hall stood in absolute, frozen silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the incredibly faint, high-pitched digital hum of a multi-million-dollar computer system waking up from a deep sleep and talking to itself. Marcus sat in the seat, staring at the digital clock on the dashboard. He was silently counting the seconds in his head, measuring time with absolute surgical precision. He could feel the eyes of 100 wealthy investors burning into his back, waiting for him to fail. 90 seconds, 100 seconds, 120 seconds. Marcus reached out his calloused, grease-stained finger. He didn't hesitate. He pressed the glowing red engine start button. Whir, whir, whir. The heavy, high-torque starter motor engaged for exactly half a second. And then, vroom! The massive, naturally aspirated 6.5-liter V12 engine exploded to life with a violent, deafening, earth-shattering roar. The sheer, raw, acoustic power of the engine physically shook the heavy glass windows of the exhibition hall. It was a terrifying, beautiful, mechanical symphony. It didn't sputter. It didn't cough. It settled immediately into a perfect, aggressive, rhythmic, flawless idle. The smell of rich, high-octane exhaust faintly wafted through the pristine room. The unmistakable smell of a living, breathing hypercar. The investors in the crowd completely lost their minds. They erupted into massive, spontaneous applause, cheering and raising their champagne glasses. The automotive journalists frantically snapped pictures of the glowing dashboard and the roaring exhaust pipes. Julian, the lead technician, stood completely paralyzed, his jaw practically hitting the floor. He had spent 20 minutes ripping the car apart in his mind, blaming the manufacturer, blaming the code, and a janitor had fixed it in 3 minutes without picking up a single tool. The massive V12 engine roared beautifully for a few moments longer before Marcus reached out and pressed the button again, shutting the beast down. The sudden silence that followed was incredibly heavy, thick with the profound realization of their own arrogance. Marcus didn't sit in the plush leather seat and soak up the glory. He didn't wait for the applause to die down. He quietly opened the carbon fiber door, stepped out of the $2 million machine, and carefully wiped a tiny, almost invisible smudge off the door sill with his clean rag. He walked straight past the stunned technicians, straight past the cheering investors, and walked right back over to his heavy yellow floor buffer. He wrapped his hands around the handles, fully preparing to finish his shift. He had a floor to polish. Wait! Vanessa Clark practically sprinted across the marble floor, completely abandoning her VIP guests, her designer heels echoing sharply. She stepped right in front of Marcus's buffer, physically blocking his path. The arrogance, the toxic condescension, the cruel mockery, it was entirely, completely gone from her face. It was replaced by a look of profound, deeply humbled, staggering awe. How? Vanessa breathed, her voice completely stripped of its CEO bravado. My elite team, the best money can buy in this city, told me the immobilizer was fried. They told me we needed to rip the steering column out. How did you know? Marcus stopped. He rested his heavy hands on the buffer handle, looking at her with tired, calm eyes. I didn't use magic, Miss Clark, Marcus said gently, his voice carrying the heavy weight of his past. I used experience. He looked at the confused, stunned faces of the young technicians standing nearby. He didn't look at them with anger, but with deep, veteran understanding. For 15 years, Marcus began, his voice echoing quietly in the space between them, I was the lead diagnostician at a high-performance tuning shop in the city. I've taken delivery of dozens of imported hypercars straight off the shipping boats. I know exactly how these factories protect their assets during transit. He looked directly at Julian, the young lead tech. You aren't a bad technician, kid, Marcus said, offering a hard truth. But you are entirely too reliant on the computer to tell you how the world works. You plugged in a scanner and expected the car to hand you the answer on a silver platter. You forgot to look at the physical reality of the situation. The car had fresh shipping straps. It was never PDI'd. You looked for a complex, catastrophic failure because it's a complex, expensive car. You forgot the absolute basics. Julian looked down at his expensive sneakers, his face burning with intense, humiliating shame. He realized that while he was analyzing terabytes of invisible data and staring blindly at code, Marcus was analyzing the context of the real world. Vanessa Clark stood perfectly still. The realization hit her with the brutal force of a freight train. She had built a massive corporate culture that aggressively worshipped expensive degrees, flashy uniforms, and digital software, while actively disregarding and openly mocking the gritty, physical, hands-on experience required to keep the real world functioning. She looked at Marcus. She remembered the cruel, horrific words she had shouted at him in front of her investors. Fix my car, janitor. She had evaluated his entire human worth, his entire intellect, based exclusively on the faded blue uniform he was wearing. She had mocked him, and in return, he had just single-handedly saved her multi-million-dollar distribution contract, her reputation, and her entire company from complete, catastrophic public humiliation. Mr. Hale, Vanessa said, her voice dropping to a respectful near whisper, completely abandoning her arrogant CEO persona. I owe you a profound, sincere public apology. My behavior tonight was entirely unacceptable. I let my extreme stress dictate my humanity, and I judged you in a way that I deeply, truly regret. Marcus nodded slowly. He didn't demand she grovel on her knees. He accepted the apology with quiet, unbreakable dignity. Apology accepted, ma'am. Panic makes people say things they don't mean. Vanessa didn't walk away. She stood her ground. I don't want you pushing a floor buffer in this building ever again, Vanessa stated, her voice returning to its firm, decisive tone, but this time fueled by respect, not arrogance. I am creating a brand new position effective tomorrow morning. Senior Import Technical Advisor for Apex Imports. You won't manage people from a desk. You will be on the floor. You will physically inspect, activate, and clear every single multi-million-dollar asset that rolls off a shipping container before my elite technicians are even allowed to plug a laptop into it. Marcus looked at her. He thought about the staggering salary a position like that commanded. It was life-changing. It was the absolute end of struggling to pay rent. It was a massive college fund for Evan. But Marcus didn't immediately jump at the offer. Ms. Clark, I am incredibly grateful, Marcus said quietly. But my son, Evan, gets out of school at 3:30 p.m. I took this night shift janitor job specifically so I could be awake to help him with his homework in the afternoons. I cannot work a standard corporate executive schedule. I am a father first, an engineer second. Vanessa didn't hesitate for a single, fleeting microsecond. She smiled warmly, a genuine smile of deep respect. You dictate your own schedule, Marcus, she said firmly. You come in when the cars arrive. You leave when you need to get your son. I don't pay you to sit in a chair for 8 hours. I am paying you to be the only person in this massive company who actually understands how to turn the key. Marcus smiled, a real, heavy, deeply relieved smile. He reached out and shook her hand firmly. Over the next few months, the entire technical culture at Apex Imports completely transformed. The maintenance protocols were entirely rewritten. Before any engineer was allowed to run a software diagnostic, they were legally required by the new manuals to perform a physical context check. Marcus no longer wore a faded blue janitor's uniform. He wore a clean polo shirt and carried a clipboard. But more importantly, as he walked the massive, noisy showroom floors, nobody ever looked past him again. Nobody ever looked at his boots and made a cruel assumption about his intellect. Because the entire company had learned a brutal, invaluable, and permanent lesson. True genius doesn't always wear a tailored suit or carry a glowing tablet. Sometimes the absolute most brilliant, essential mind in the entire room is simply the quiet man standing in the corner, who possesses the incredible courage to step up when everyone else is completely paralyzed by panic. If you firmly believe that true skill, deep experience, and quiet competence are completely independent of a person's job title or the uniform they wear, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories of the quiet truth winning in the end. Tell us in the comments down below, have you ever been severely underestimated, ignored, or mocked in a professional environment just because of your appearance, only to step up and prove everyone completely wrong?